Welcome everyone to the 2024 February 19th OpenPlanetary Lunch Talk. I'm Chase Millian. I'm the CEO of Million Concepts and also a board member of OpenPlanetary. Our speaker today is Tanya Harrison. Dr. Harrison has a um, uh, multi-decade career. Am I allowed to say that? We're the same age. Um, in planetary science and astronomy, spanning academia, industry, um, honestly, Tanya's done too many neat things to list, although among her neat things is she's written a couple books, which I have here, For All Mankind and Me and the Martians. So you should buy and read her books. Um, the talk today is Tanya's going to tell us um, about what planetary science and industry is like. And I think it's important to note that when we came up with this talk a few weeks ago, the landscape for uh, NASA-funded research, careers in planetary science and astronomy, etc., was much different than it appears to be this week. For future historians, this week, as of yesterday, there seemed to be a large threat that a substantial fraction of the NASA workforce was going to be laid off. That appears to have not happened yet, although the threat still looms, as far as I understand. Um, Given that, there may be a general sense of sort of a constant hostility between industry and academia. And I think there are some good reasons for that, but I also think it would be a naive for us not to understand that people in both of those worlds um, do need to work together and have always historically worked together. And if we are going to understand each other really and work with each other, we need to understand the priorities. So specifically talking from the perspective of academia, we need to understand the priorities, the constraints, and the rules by which our colleagues in industry are operating. And that will allow us, if we want to move into industry, it will allow us to do that more easily. And if we want to work with those people, given whatever role they have in the future of planetary exploration along with us, it will make us better prepared to do that. So I hope everyone finds this very useful. I know I will, because I've talked to Tanya about this a lot. And thank you, Tanya, for being here.
No problem. Yeah, like Chase said, we talked about this before any of the stuff that happened in the last week had come together. And this almost makes it very timely for this conversation to happen. I want to kick this off by saying, one, this is not going to be a super formal talk. I want it to feel more like a discussion. And two, I'm not coming in trying to say industry is rosy, you should come to it because that's where all the money is. I feel like a lot of people that sort of have gone in the track, like on LinkedIn and stuff about leaving academia, they they've drugged the industry Kool-Aid quite a bit. There are pros and cons on both sides, depending on what you want out of your career, what you want out of your life. And so the goal of today's talk is just going to be, you know, what are some of the differences between industry and academia? And in particular, if you're thinking about making that shift, what are some of the things that you should expect to run into when you start hunting for jobs? If you decide to do so, what are the sort of things you should look for? A little bit of talking about pursuing entrepreneurship. Both Chase and I have founded companies. I don't know if anybody else in here has as well, but certainly if you have or want to talk about that, we can talk more about that in the discussion. And I'll share a little bit about my own pathway and kind of navigating through these different worlds. I seem to be coming down with a cold, so I apologize that I keep coughing. I will try to not cough too much during the talk. These slides are going to be more just an anchor to kind of follow the conversation and not a bunch of bullet points for people to follow. So I see a lot of familiar faces here, or at least familiar names. This feels like a good throwback to when I was a Mars scientist. So great to see folks that I know. Great to see folks that I have never met before. So if you're not familiar with me, my background has been all over the place in the space sector. I went through school up to the level of a master's degree. And then I went to go work technically in industry for 4 years at Malin Space Science Systems. If you are not a Martian, you might not have heard of them before, but they've built a lot of the cameras that have gone to Mars on various rovers and satellites. as well as some non-Mars cameras, but I feel like they're mostly known for Mars. Um, I say sort of industry in this case because at the time that I worked there, Malin was very much just a government subcontractor. So it didn't really operate like a typical commercial company, and certainly not like a new space type company that you would run today. All the money that we were bringing in was through contracts from NASA for cameras for these missions and to operate those cameras. So I would say it's sort of government adjacent. It operated a little bit like academia, a little bit like government. For a few different reasons, after a few years, I left Malin and went back to school to get a PhD. And that decision was a bit non-traditional in that I actually never had any intention of pursuing academia for my career. My goal had been to go back and instead of working at Malin as a JPL subcontractor, I wanted to go work for JPL actual, but stay doing mission operations and maybe work in mission design and eventually become a PI. So I didn't really have becoming a professor in my plan, but it was still sort of this like kind of academic pathway compared to going into industry. Uh, my path kind of veered in a different direction near the end of my PhD. I got a call out of the blue from Arizona State University because they were launching this thing called the New Space Initiative, where they were looking to make partnerships with commercial new space companies. So not the old primes like Boeing and Lockheed, but at the time, the newer companies that people probably hadn't heard about very much at that point. I think this was early enough in the new space era that if you asked anybody to name a new space company, they could probably only name like SpaceX and Virgin Galactic, maybe Blue Origin, but even they weren't super well known, I think, at the time. And they were looking for somebody to inhabit this director of research role that was not interested in a typical tenure track faculty type position. They wanted somebody to help create these partnerships for going in together on mission proposals, instrument proposals, getting the companies to partner with the university for student internships, things like that. I thought this sounded like a really interesting opportunity. And so I went ahead and accepted the offer and did that from about 2016 to 2019. So through that, I got connected with a ton of different companies in the new space sector. And a lot of the job early on was trying to figure out which companies were real, like which ones actually had a legitimate business model, and which ones were just crazy rich people that had cash to burn. Unsurprisingly, there is a lot of that in the space industry, as I'm sure you've seen. But now it's more of a real thing. There are companies out there that are actually creating real products. They are making some money. So it's a little bit less chaotic than it was in the early days. Through that job, I got connected with Planet, which is an Earth observation satellite company based out of San Francisco. They seemed really cool. When I first met them, they were about 30 people that were building satellites in their lunchroom behind a shower curtain. They had bought a target with the goal of imaging the whole world every day to look for change. I thought it seemed like a cool place to work, but I also thought, how could I convince the people to hire somebody with PhD in Martian landslides to work at an Earth observation satellite company? And then someone reminded me, well, you worked in mission operations for cameras. Like a camera is a camera, regardless of what planet it's pointed at. And I don't know why this didn't occur to me at the time, but I thought, you're right. And so I started networking with people at the company, first through Twitter. The company was so young at that point, they hadn't launched very many satellites. And so my initial foot in the door with them was one of the early employees who was a former longtime NASA employee said, hey, could you come to the office and give a talk about how you did mission operations at Malin? Because maybe there's something we could learn for when we're going to do mission operations once we've built up our constellation. So it was a way to take my Mars mission expertise and apply it to something that this commercial company really needed to know. So I went out to their office, I gave this talk, and eventually, after working with them in a few different capacities over the years, they eventually got a contract with NASA. They wanted somebody to come and kind of lead that relationship who knew how to talk to scientists, but also understood Planet and their satellites and their data products. And since I had been working with them as a researcher, using their data, studying gullies in the Canadian Arctic, they called me and they said they wanted to hire me to do this. And this is where my career kind of goes in an interesting direction in that they didn't offer me a particular job. They were just like, we want to hire you to kind of lead this relationship. And so I asked what that would entail, and they're like, we're not really sure. We just want to hire you, and like we can figure things out later. So I came in and essentially spent about a month trying to figure out what I thought this company needed versus what I could offer to them. And from that, created a job title and a job description and then presented to them. And the person that was my boss was like, okay. And that kind of started a trend from there on of inventing jobs for myself. And I think this ended up giving people false hope because as a scientist, I was now going to these space conferences, giving presentations about doing science at a space company. And of course, other people that were majoring in things like planetary science were like, oh, how can I get a job doing this stuff? I said, well, I didn't actually apply for a job that was listed. I just had to kind of convince these people that I had skills that they needed, and they eventually hired me. This has happened in essentially every job I've had since Planet and leaving Planet. So this is where networking and marketing yourself and just being relentless about that is really important. So we'll talk about that kind of in like the career tips a little bit later. So now I'm working in sort of science strategy consulting across multiple space companies to help connect them with the research community, both in the sort of government research and academic research, so that I can try to make better links so that these two groups can speak to each other more directly. And hopefully that can lead to better innovation, more opportunities on both sides. I'm doing it right now mostly with a company called GHGSat, which is a methane satellite company monitoring missions around the world. So let's get into some comparisons between industry and academia. And here I don't use versus in like the fighting term, but more just comparing some of the differences that you'll see. A big one are priorities. Some of this might seem really obvious, but I'm going to go through it just in case. Industry cares about profit. That is the number one thing most of these companies care about. Even if you find companies that are like certified B Corps or they have some kind of impact statement, at the end of the day, everything is in service to the dollar. Unless you happen to be working for a company, like I mentioned before, founded by one of these crazy billionaires that just has money to burn to do whatever you want. So even if they have a mission, anything you're doing there leads toward this priority of generating revenue in some way. To some extent, there's also a priority toward product and service innovation. But again, that is all toward the idea of how can this product make us more money? How can delivering this service make us more money? And I'm not saying that is good or bad. That is just kind of a statement because we live in a capitalist society. So this ties directly to the next thing, which are timelines. Companies live and die typically on quarterly sales cycles. So the pace at which you're expected to do things, the pace you're expected to reply to emails, the number of calls you have to sit in on a day can be a lot faster than you're used to in academia. Even if you're not going from academia to industry, if you're trying to collaborate with people on the industry side, they are not used to the pace of academia or even in some cases the pace of government. And so they don't understand that something like a university inherently moves much more slowly. And so you might get people that poke you far too often for things because they just don't know that's not how fast academia works. But if you're going the other direction, it can certainly be a little bit of a culture shock where it's like, oh, these people are expecting replies to their emails in the same day. Whereas I think we all know professors that take 2 to 4 weeks to reply to their emails. So definitely a huge difference there. Another difference that I don't think we think about all that much on the science side is the real world impact of the stuff that you're working on. I know some people here are working on active space missions. So obviously the things that you're doing are having an impact. You are driving a rover on Mars or you're operating a spacecraft at Jupiter. But a lot of people that are doing scientific research on the purely academic side, that work tends to sit on the pages of papers behind a paywall that are then read by people within the same echo chamber. And so it's not necessarily breaking beyond that to be implemented in the real world. And partly because of capitalism, the fastest way to have your work make an impact in the real world is to do that through commercialization. So if you're working on something like climate tech or climate solutions, I think this is a very practical field to use as an example. doing this work through a company is the fastest way to get enough money to work at a pace where you can actually be implementing some of the stuff that you're interested in doing in a way that academia is just not set up to be able to do. And again, not saying that this is a positive or a negative, just two very different things in these systems. You could still work with companies that can take the stuff that you're doing and implement that in the world as a product or a service or whatever it might be without leaving academia. My caution to you there is some of them will try to get you to work with them for free because they see universities as free labor, and you should never work for free. These companies have money. They will always try to get academics to work for free. And we're used to doing so much free labor as academics that a lot of times people will say yes, especially in the case of like, if it's a company that maybe has some cachet from like a marketing standpoint, like, oh, I can say it's really cool that I worked with insert company here. But if you're somebody with a PhD doing consulting for a company that has money, you should be charging at least $200 an hour for your time, if not far more than that. I will be completely transparent. My consulting rate is $500 an hour if I'm doing hourly billing. These companies pay consulting firms like McKinsey and Deloitte literally tens of thousands of dollars to write reports that people like academics like that we would write in our sleep. And they're paying it for that to be done by people generally that don't have advanced degrees and generally people that don't necessarily have subject matter expertise in the area that you're working on. Or you might have a subject matter expert that's kind of leading the team with a lot more junior people that are actually working on that report. So the work that you're doing with these companies, like you deserve to be paid for this work. Do not let them undervalue you. And if you're really lucky, companies might see the work that you're doing and offer you a job, like just hire you to come and continue the work that you're doing to do it with them. I saw this happen directly at Planet. They had a researcher that was using their data shortly before I came on, and they had written a paper about a novel way to make a data fusion product. And the company thought this was so cool that this might be something they could commercialize. And so they hired that professor and eventually some of his I believe it was his postdocs, to come on, and they built a whole team around him, and that became a commercial product that the company then started to sell. But since that paper was just out in the world as a thing that anybody could download, theoretically, the company could have tried to recreate that on their own and not necessarily hire this professor. So it's nice that in this case, the company was acting in good faith and wanted to hire the researchers to do this. But you do sometimes have companies that are trolling the scientific literature to look for this kind of stuff and essentially exploit the work of academics to profit off of, and they may not even contact you to do that. So by proactively seeking out partnerships between some of these companies and you on the research side, you might be able to mitigate some of that happening if there are companies that are working on things that are relevant to the work that you're doing. So speaking of job offers, salaries is obviously another big difference. I think this comes up all the time in discussions of industry versus academia. Salaries vary widely depending on, the company, the geographic location, the level of the job. Are you a manager, director, VP, something like that? But in general, the salaries that you'll see in industry are much higher than you tend to see on the academic side. This is important to know because in some places, the salary range is required to be listed in a job posting, depending on what state the job is in. But sometimes if there's not a salary listed, these companies will ask you, like, what salary range are you looking for? And I saw this happen at a previous job where I was being paid significantly more than two of my coworkers with PhDs in scientific fields, including one person that was at the same level as me. And the difference was purely because of the negotiation. That person didn't know what to ask for when they came in. And so their starting salary offer was significantly lower than what mine was because I knew somebody that worked at the company previously. And I contacted them and I was like, hey, what should I be asking? At that point, I had never really worked in industry. And this was a San Francisco, Bay Area company. So I knew I didn't want to undervalue myself, especially in a role where they're asking you to move to a place like San Francisco where the cost of living is so exorbitantly high. This person told me, as someone with a PhD getting hired at this level, in San Francisco, you should not be asking for less than $180,000 a year. That was an unfathomable number to me because at the time I was working at a university making 55K. I never would have thought to ask for that much money. But I also, after having that conversation, went to a cost of living calculator where you can actually see, like, for how much money you're making in this city, how much do you need to make in this other city to have the same quality of life? This cost of living in San Francisco was literally double the cost of living in where I was before. So even then, it's like, okay, I would still have to be making six figures to just have the same quality of life that I have right now in this place where the cost of living is much lower. Um, so having this in mind, especially if you're applying for a job where they're requiring you to relocate, be empowered to have that salary negotiation. A lot of these companies will also pay for relocation expenses, sometimes to the tune of like $20,000 to $30,000. So be ready to negotiate for that as well if people want you to move. Which ties to the next point, flexibility or lack thereof. I think we've seen in the news how many companies are pushing toward return to work mandates. Some companies are extremely traditional. They want you in the office 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and they are not very flexible about that. I would say that tends to be a lot of kind of the older, stodgier, bigger companies. Most companies now seem to be shifting toward a hybrid model where they want you in the office like 2 to 3 days a week and you can work from home the rest of the time. There are some companies that are still remote first or have a lot of remote options, even if the company itself is headquartered somewhere in particular. If the job has responsibilities that don't require being on site, or they might require you to travel to headquarters once a quarter or something like that. But those jobs are becoming less common, it seems like. Teamwork is something that I had to kind of adjust my mental approach to moving into industry. In research, we collaborate with other people all the time, right? We have multiple co-authors on papers, we have research teams, we have science teams on missions. But I think especially from the act of pursuing a PhD, which is often a very isolating experience, we tend to think that we have to do so much stuff ourselves and like we can't ask for help, we can't work with other people. And maybe this is just me, I don't know, but this was kind of the impression that I had coming into the industry side of things. And I remember having a conversation with my boss at one of these workplaces, and we had to set quarterly objectives and key results, OKRs. This is something you'll hear a lot in industry as well. And usually these were things like, what are you doing on this team to satisfy the team goals, and how do those tie into the company's quarterly goals and the company's like overall fiscal targets. But we were also asked to have a personal goal for the quarter. And I had listed that my personal goal was to relearn Python because I had not used it since I worked at Malin writing Python code to control Mastcam on Curiosity. And my boss said, okay, well, that's great if you want to do that, but you do realize that is this guy's entire job, right? Like if you need a script for something, just ask him to write it. And that was such a mind-blowing thing to have my boss specifically say, no, that's why this other team exists. Like, it's not your job to do this. That's their job. And I realized at that point, I was like, oh, I'm not inconveniencing this person by asking him for help. I'm keeping him employed. And so that just took this huge mental shift of like, okay, I should be asking for people for help. That's why they're here in the first place. So you don't have to take everything on. I think another thing that was really hard for me to adjust to was the idea of using slides and presentations that I did not create. Usually there'll be a lot of like standard marketing decks that they want you to use and content that other people on your team or the company in general have made that they want you to use in presentations to make sure that the brand identity is cohesive and that everything looks nice, because the standards are going to be a lot higher for a company than you might have for just like a typical conference talk like at LPSC. That was really hard. I felt like I was plagiarizing other people's work by using slides that other people had created until I realized, again, no, that's literally what you're supposed to be doing. That's why we have these templates from marketing. They want you to be using this stuff. And the last thing is work environment. This is probably one of the biggest straight up downsides of industry, but it is not all that different from academia. in terms of harassment and not much being done about it. I feel like maybe academics might be surprised to hear this because, like, if you have a professor that has tenure in a position and they're harassing subordinates, it's impossible to get rid of those people in a lot of cases. So you would think at a company where it generally is not that difficult paperwork wise to fire someone, that they would have more leverage, more incentive to get rid of problematic people like that. And it does not seem to be the case at all. It is widespread. It's happened to me. It's happened to far too many people that I know. It is very disheartening in a lot of cases. I'd say the upside is that there are a lot of more jobs, I would say probably proportionally, available in industry versus academia if you're looking specifically for professor positions. So you can try to more easily move from one environment to another. And I'm not saying that every place is terrible, just that it's bad on the industry side, just like we have problems on the academic side. Obviously, another work environment stress is massive layoffs sometimes. Like we're seeing this right now across the tech sector and in space specifically. Again, the upside here is that there are more jobs available. And specifically in space, I do see a lot of community support. Like there were just massive layoffs at Blue Origin, and I'm seeing a lot of the community rallying together to try to help those people find other jobs elsewhere, especially on places like LinkedIn. So there is a nice community there in terms of trying to support people looking for new jobs. Similarly, if you have students that are trying to break into the industry with their first job, tons and tons and tons of supportive people that really want to help students get their foot in the door. So that's been a really beautiful thing to see. So with all the upsides and all the downsides, the good and the bad, like why should academics consider industry as an option? Like I just said, there are typically more jobs out there at any given time than you might see available in academia, but you might need to get creative about looking for those jobs, and in particular, the job titles, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I think at the bigger picture level, and this is the kind of thing that Chase and I have talked a lot about recently, industry, one, needs more subject matter experts. If you go to a lot of these space companies, you will be shocked at how few subject matter experts there are, or even people with any background in space whatsoever. When I came into Planet, I could count on one hand the number of people that had any remote sensing experience. And there were like dozens of people there that probably couldn't even tell you, well, not probably, I interacted with them. There are many people there that couldn't even tell you what a pixel was when the data product that they are selling is images. So there are spots for subject matter experts in these companies, but I think there seems to be a lack of people that fit those molds applying for a lot of those jobs. And part of it is because the way that the jobs are titled are very non-intuitive for the people that have the skills to fill those jobs. I've tried to convince some companies to make those job titles more obvious. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't. But again, we'll talk about those job titles in a little bit. We also just need more people on the industry side that have ethics and have a pure desire to be doing the things that we want to be doing in space. Maybe capitalism inherently strips that away from the industry side of things. I will admit I've become very cynical in the last couple of years in terms of being able to, for a company to have ethics when you are driven by profit, especially once you become a publicly traded company, you are legally beholden to your shareholders to generate a profit, even if that goes against the mission of your company in the first place. And that is a hard thing to accept. But my hope is that maybe if you stack the deck in the direction of doing real things and doing this with people that actually care about the impact that those things have on the world and not just building useless vaporware, maybe this is something where we can slowly make a difference and change the culture over time. Maybe that's a little too optimistic, but I can hope. This is also why I'd like to encourage academics to pursue entrepreneurship. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So if you're not looking to just found your own company, which is very stressful, and you want to start hunting for jobs in the industry, sort of like academia, I think networking is key. Research companies, find out what they're doing, find ones that you are interested in, either the mission or just the work that they're doing in general, and go online or go to their, go to LinkedIn, go to their websites, connect with recruiters, connect with some of the more technical people that work there, See if you can find out who the hiring manager is for any of the roles that you might be interested in, so that you can apply for them. If you can find someone internally that is willing to give a referral for you, that is usually a very selfish benefit to them, because a lot of these companies offer referral bonuses from like two to I've even seen like $5,000 in some cases if they hire somebody that you recommended and they stay there for 60 or 90 days or something like that. So there's incentive for them to recommend you if they think that you'd be a good fit for the job. Go to industry conferences if you can to network with people and find out more about these companies. But I'll say that with the caveat that once you see the price of registering for these industry conferences, you will no longer complain that the AGU fall meeting is expensive ever again. And having a social having a social media presence can also really help with networking. There's a really great example of this guy named Aravind on LinkedIn, who started out just posting a lot of stuff about his thoughts and analysis of the Earth observation sector. And now he's become this respected thought leader by the whole Earth observation industry. He works as a consultant for massive companies. Like, he just posted recently that he finished a contract with L'Oreal, who has an Earth observation strategy. I never would have guessed that a company like L'Oreal would care about Earth observation, but apparently they do. Because of some of the agricultural impacts of the things that go into their products, I think was the rationale there. And he runs a relatively newly launched Earth observation industry conference. And he was able to build that up entirely from just posting incessantly on LinkedIn and eventually creating a newsletter, posting a lot on Twitter back before Twitter imploded. My first foot in the door at Planet was thanks to my Twitter presence. That's how I connected initially with that former NASA employee that worked there. So it's a great way to find people. Obviously, Twitter's not a great place for that anymore. I'm seeing a lot of people pop up on Blue Sky, maybe Threads, but just having some kind of presence online where people can see who you are and what you specialize in is really helpful. Also, I guess since I just mentioned it, like LinkedIn does matter. As gross as it kind of feels, I think, certainly when I was in academia, I didn't think LinkedIn was useful. I still think a lot of stuff people post on there is maybe questionably useful, but it is good from a networking standpoint. One of my old bosses on the industry side said when she had a candidate come across her desk for a role, the first thing she would do is go to LinkedIn and see how many mutual connections they had to see, what kind of overlap was there. So on the industry side, they are looking at LinkedIn. Even if you're not posting anything, just having a profile and your job history listed on there and your areas of expertise, that can be enough. You don't necessarily need to be on there posting all the time, because, like I said, a lot of stuff people are posting is just kind of a waste of time. Oops, I missed a slide there. But so in terms of job hunting, some of the job titles to look for, again, specifically geared toward like planetary science type people, that might be less obvious than things that have scientist in the title. Certainly when I started my job hunting, I was a little too literal. It was like, I am a scientist. Let me look for jobs that are called scientist. I got lucky in that my first job working at Malin was called assistant staff scientist, but that was also not one that I hunted out myself. Somebody suggested I go look there. But it was kind of a good eye-opening moment of, oh, I didn't realize that a company that builds cameras would be hiring a scientist. I figured they would just want engineers. So poke around at companies, even if you don't think that they might be hiring a scientist, because they might, one, have science jobs that would be a really good fit, or two, have jobs that are relevant, but the name is something that seems kind of elusive. A big one is customer success, like a customer success manager or a customer success engineer. If you're talking specifically in something like Earth observation, these are generally GIS technicians. These are people that are helping the customers process the data, use it, whatever. And a lot of these people are not highly technical, the end users, that is, so they need help from somebody that actually knows how to churn through the data. You might see some of these jobs listed as GIS technician, but I would say that tends to be more at companies that are really highly technical and not the more kind of generalized Earth observation companies that are focused on just, we want to sell imagery or SAR or whatever to as many people as possible. Product manager is also one that comes up quite a bit, where having technical knowledge in the data set itself is really helpful. So again, this might be imagery, this could be SAR, this could be thermal. Hyperspectral right now is really hot on the industry side of things. So there's a lot of opportunities there. Program managers, something that companies are always looking for. So if you have program management experience, that's something to look into. Partnerships, I would say, like on paper, that's a lot of what my jobs have been since ASU onward, working at New Space, is creating partnerships between universities and the company, or nonprofits and the company, or certain government agencies and the company. Um, Sales engineers, these are people that tend to support a salesperson by like making the technical demos for that person to show, because usually a salesperson at a company is not very technical. They are there to just close deals, put things through Salesforce, sign invoices, stuff like that. They don't have the time or the technical background, usually, not in every case, but usually, to be the one to have the nitty gritty conversation about what the data can do and the specs and all that kind of stuff. Um, Business development is another really good area to look at if you're a technical person, especially if you're really good at science communication, because these are roles where essentially it's like, how likable are you? And by proxy, how much do people like the company? They want people that can go out, have really good conversations, schmooze clients, but at a level that you can have the technical conversations with the engineers or whoever the technical people might be, depending on what type of company you're at. But you can also communicate at a very high level to like certain stakeholders that maybe don't have that technical knowledge. So you can sort of code switch at a range of levels in the product or service or whatever it is that the company is offering. So a lot of people in business development are people that started out as something more technical and then shifted into that role over time. It also tends to be a really great way to just travel a whole lot, because we'll send you to lots of conferences and meetings with potential customers to go and schmooze them. Some companies have customer education segments where they are generating a lot of content for customers to learn how to work with the data or the products and platforms. And if you're interested in pursuing sales, sales can be an option if you do want to be a more technical salesperson. It is a stressful life that I would not want. Generally, you have like a quarterly quota that you have to hit. And if you don't hit that, you either don't get paid your full salary that quarter or you might get fired. But the flip side is you can get massive bonuses if you hit or exceed that target. Sometimes you get ridiculous awards. Like some of these companies will have awards for the person that has the highest sales for that quarter, and they send them to like Mexico for a week or something like that. It's a little ridiculous, a little extravagant, but it's a job option if it's something that you are interested in pursuing. Or if you don't care about work-life balance and want to drive yourself insane, but have complete control over what you're doing, you could become an entrepreneur. And the pros here is you have complete control over your work and your vision to some extent, until you get a board of advisors and investors behind you if you go that route. The cons are that being an entrepreneur is a slog. You will work long hours. Fundraising is really stressful. And if you are not the kind of person that's inclined to have those sorts of conversations, you'll need to hire somebody to do that. And it usually takes a long time before you're profitable. So you'll end up spending a good chunk of your own money to get a business off the ground, usually. This kind of ties back to the idea that we need more people with real subject matter expertise starting companies. And NSF has actually recognized this. A couple of years ago, they commissioned a working group through AGU that I was a part of. That was a mix of scientists, industry people, government people, and investors, asking the question of how do we encourage more geoscientists to pursue entrepreneurship? Because NSF was like, we're tired of seeing ridiculous climate companies proposing solutions that have no basis in science when we have knowledgeable people that could be proposing useful things, but they're not pursuing this as a career path. So we wrote a report. I forget if it's on the NSF website or the AGU website, but I can try to hunt it down if there's a way to send it out through the mailing list or something. But NSF wants to try to encourage more people, particularly in climate research, to pursue entrepreneurship. Maybe you're not the kind of person that wants to found your own company or be a CEO, which is completely understandable, especially as a scientist. But you could partner with people to do that. So maybe you find co-founders to make a founding team. You find the person that can have the business conversations, the person that can have those investor conversations and chase down that money. And you can be the chief scientist. You're the one making sure that the stuff the company is doing is anchored in reality. Um, but sometimes you have early stage startups that are working on this kind of stuff. They have a good idea, but they don't necessarily know a scientist to bring on board, and or they don't have the money to hire a full-time person, which leads to the last option that I'm going to talk about, which is consulting or like fractional work for some of these companies. And this option gives you the ultimate control of what you choose to do in terms of your work. You can pick how many hours you want to work. You can pick how much you're going to charge. You can decide if you're going to charge per hour or per project or per day, whatever way you want to bill your hours. You can decide who you want to work with from an ethical standpoint. And it gives you a little bit of redundancy against what we're seeing right now with like massive layoffs. I was originally going to say just on the industry side, but I guess now we're seeing it on the government side as well. So you've kind of diversifying your income streams a little bit. But that also ties to some of the cons, means there's a lack of stability unless or until you get some anchor clients that you know are going to be paying you for months on end. And that can be hard to find if you haven't built up credibility in that area yet, or you haven't built up like a Rolodex of business contacts in that area. In the US specifically, obviously there's huge stresses over access to health insurance if you're self-employed. I mostly do consulting in Canada, and so luckily here that's not an issue. But I fully acknowledge that if I still lived in the States, this would not be a job option for me because I have some health problems that are extremely expensive. And I just would not be able to be an independent consultant under those circumstances. But if that is not something you have to think about, or you can access, somewhat affordable options in the relative scheme of things through like state programs, it might be something that you can look into if you did decide to go this route. Taxes can also be kind of an annoying thing to deal with if you're a consultant, because generally you're getting paid all these lump sums for your contracts, and then you pay a bunch of taxes at the end of the year. So that's just something to think about if you're not used to working in a way where you're collecting money where the taxes are not being taken out ahead of time. So I saw the chat thing flashing quite a bit while I was talking, but I was going to try to wait to the end before you open it up into a discussion.